Today we're going to talk about my least favorite sort of groups of paradigms regarding criminological theory. Just because it's my least favorite, it does not mean that it's not useful. It does not mean that it's not valid. I just personally prefer the more evidence-based, the more straightforward theories of crime. However, these perspectives have given us lots of insight in how to see crime and how to view it, because the conflict and critical perspectives are very out of the box, and so they have a place in criminology. I personally prefer the neoclassical theories because they're straightforward, right? And so from a research standpoint, you have very straightforward variables that you can measure and get scientific confirmation as to whether they're good or not. Some of these conflict and critical theories are very difficult to research. Some of them are on the verge of impossible to research given the technological abilities that we have in the current world. Nonetheless, we're gonna go down a rabbit hole here of conflict and critical criminology. So these two theories sort of fall within this larger paradigm, which some people refer to as the behavior of law paradigm. And essentially, and don't confuse this with Donald Black's behavior of law theory, which we're going to discuss later, but this paradigm that contains critical and conflict criminology is sort of based on the fact that crime exists because humans say it does. All right? You're like, what? Well, if you think about the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible, right? When they ate from the tree of knowledge instead of the tree of life, right? At some point in the story, right, God tells them and he says, "Hey, you can't eat from this tree," right? The second that God said, "Don't eat from this tree," sin was created, or crime in that case, right? So the second that one person makes a rule that everyone else says is legitimate, or enough people say is a legitimate rule, or for some reason that rule is legitimized, they have in that very moment created crime or deviance. So the second that we say this is the way things should be done, we have also created the opposite of that. And the opposite of that is usually deviant. And if the law codifies it as not legal, it is illegal and therefore is crime. So there are a gazillion theories that fall within this perspective or within this paradigm. And so we're going to cover two perspectives that fall within this paradigm, right? So a paradigm is like a group of perspectives that are kind of similar, and then perspectives that are a little more separated from each other, and then within each perspective there are myriad theories. So we're going to look at the critical and conflict perspectives within criminology. All right, so the critical and conflict perspectives come from sociology and philosophy, and they've been applied to criminology. And because they've been applied to criminology, you'll see the theories work a little differently than everything else we've done thus far. And that is also why people like myself, who grew up in sort of the traditional criminological paradigms, it's difficult to reconcile these theories with what I know. But also for someone like myself, I was trained in my PhD to be very focused on evidence-based policy. A lot of these theories do not really provide a lot of useful insights when it comes to evidence-based policy currently. Okay? However, it is important to understand these theories because they do explain a lot. It makes a lot of sense. All right? So we'll start off with what the conflict. We'll start off with the conflict paradigm, but then we also need to think about what the hell does conflict mean, right? So everything that we have done up to this point falls within the consensus perspective within sociology, okay? So all the social process theories, all of the social structural theories we've done, even the neoclassical theories, even the psychological theories, right? Pretty much most of academic discourse about any aspect of social life would fall within the consensus perspective, meaning that we all think that most people in a society share the same morals and beliefs, and they think the same things are important, right? So, for instance, in America, right, we assume that most people are in a consensus that hard work is important, right? That putting your head down, minding your own business, caring for other people, being altruistic, right? Those are things that we can say, oh, well, I would say most people in America agree that those are important values or morals, right? And that's what the consensus perspective essentially says, is that in any society, most people are in consensus regarding what is good and what is important and what is justifiable, right? So then when we, so essentially it says that our values then determine our interests. And what we mean by that is like what we think is good or moral or justifiable, right? That impacts what we want to pursue with our goals, right? So if we think in a society that everyone should have the right to healthcare, to basic healthcare, right? Then our society's interests would involve voting for policy and for politicians that would implement affordable healthcare for everyone, right? So what the consensus perspective says is that most people in a society have the same values and therefore have the same political, social, cultural interests. And so when we think about all of those other theories of crime that we've talked about thus far, they all fall within this paradigm, because essentially what they say is, hey, everyone is supposed to be acting normal. Why are these groups of people not acting normally? Why are all these groups of people not falling within the consensus of society? We need to understand that, right? So all of these other theories of crime that we've studied thus far are perplexed by the fact that some people are not acting quote unquote normally. And so therefore they try to explain that. But the conflict perspective says no, conflicts are a normal part of society. That essentially what they say is there is no consensus. We might think there is consensus based on the fact that people with power and money are able to push their morals onto us and silence us, right? Or at least try to, right? That there's always this conflict of interest between many different groups of different sizes and different power within a society. And that the organized state, and what we mean by the organized state, we were talking about like the government, right? The government and the police and all aspects of the government, they represent the values of the groups that are in power at that moment, right? So currently, if we look at most of our state governors, most of our senators, most of our, and then our executive branch, right, are Republican. And they're not just Republican, they're very conservative Republican at this moment. If you look at the interests, right, that the government has pursued in that time, trying to build a ridiculous wall around the border, right, trying to let Obamacare fail. The conflict perspective says that there are multiple groups of people within a society who sometimes have power and who sometimes don't. And then when a group has power, the organized state reflects their interests. And so they say that values, instead of our values driving our interests instead determine our values. And I'll give you an example. Most people who support the Republican government or the Republican Party don't seem to care about the environment, right? They don't care about environmental protections. They don't like the regulations that it puts on businesses, right? Like if I can't use styrofoam anymore, I can't use plastic straws anymore, can't use plastic bags anymore, right? That's more expensive on these businesses. And so the Republican Party knows they can't just say, look, screw the environment, because that's not appropriate. They know they can't say that. So they don't make an argument about the environment. Instead, they make an argument about American businesses and the values of you shouldn't regulate business too much, because if you regulate business too much, you lose jobs and you tear down the economy, right? And so they support initiatives that are damaging to the environment, okay? Because their interest, which is having money, right? Or perceiving that whatever the result of destroying the environment will somehow result in money, right? And therefore, when they're confronted with the environmental argument, they say it's not an environmental argument, it's a business regulation argument. And in America, we're a capitalist country, we shouldn't be regulating businesses that much, right? The private sector will regulate itself if you just leave it alone, right? So their interest, which is money and wealth or whatever, financial security, jobs, right? That determines values. And in that case, within the Republican Party, they value jobs, the economy, and that stuff over the long-term sustainability of the environment and ultimately the United States, right? Whereas Democrats will say, look, we need to tax larger, like more expensive business, richer people, because we need to use that money to regulate businesses so that they don't destroy our environment, so that we don't constantly make more plastic, because none of the plastic that's ever been made has disintegrated yet. It's still there. It's piling up in the Pacific Ocean. What if we destroy all the fish? What are we going to do about our grandchildren? Right? So their interest, which is long-term sustainability, so that the United States can last for a very long time, so the environment can last for a very long time, so that our great-grandchildren can actually see snow, their values then impact their interest, which is let's make things a little bit more expensive now. Let's be a little more uncomfortable now with the fact that I can't just use plastic straws all the time, and that I have to put my mouth on the rim or on the lid or on the rim of a glass, or that I maybe have to use a stainless steel straw or a paper straw. Let's be a little inconvenienced right now so that our grandchildren can still breathe. Right? But right now, Democrats have very little power, so there's nothing they can do about it. So what conflict theories say is that there is not a consensus among the people in a society. It might seem like it. The law might, if you only look at the law, right, it might seem like there's consensus, but there are groups of people who don't have the power for that to reflect in the overall for that to reflect in the law or the organized state. And so moving forward within the conflict perspective, that's the way we should view the organized state, right? And they're not wrong, right? It's not wrong. Why are businesses allowed to door-to-door solicit for you to buy their crap, but panhandling on the street is not legal? There are always smaller groups that don't have power. So when we apply the conflict perspective to criminology, there are some things we can think about. Powerful groups of people are legally freer to pursue their interests. All right, so think of an example. A powerful group of people is white men in America, right? You can make the argument that we are freer to pursue our interests. And the way that the law was set up is that if you have more financial wealth, you essentially have more power in this country, right? So maybe you are listening to this and you maybe came from a low socioeconomic status background, and you want to become a rich business owner, right? The path to success for you is way more difficult than the path to success for someone who grew up, like me, in an upper middle class home, right? And it's even easier for someone who grew up in a very rich home, right? The opportunities that are available, understanding the law and the policies, right? It might be easier for some to follow policies than others. For instance, here's another example. In New York, right, you have to have your car registered, and you have to do this in any state in the country, but you have to have your car registered. That costs money. You also have to in New York, you have to have your car inspected, which also costs money, right? So automatically, people who have more money, it's easier for them to get their car registered, to get their car inspected. And so they have a smaller chance of being bothered by the police because of their money and essentially power, they're able to follow those rules. They are freer to go about their day because they have more power through money this time. Those with power are freer to follow their interests. People with less power are more likely to be labeled or defined as criminals for seeking their interests. For the longest time, gay people just wanted to get married. They just wanted to have the same legal definition as straight couples so that when their partner is on their deathbed and someone needs to pull the plug, their dad, who's disowned them, isn't the one in charge of that decision. Or mom, or uncle, whatever. That's all they wanted. But up until like 2015 or 14, it was considered illegal. That was labeled as illegal. It wasn't necessarily a crime. It was decriminalized like way back in the day. But it was still not legal. Their interest, gay people's interest, or people from the LGBTQ community's interests, were not labeled as legal up until Obama. People who prefer to get high as opposed to get drunk, their interests were labeled as illegal. And so then it caused people who don't want to be hungover the next day, who don't want to be violent from alcohol, who don't want to beat their spouse because they're so damn drunk, who don't want to make bad decisions because they're so drunk. All they want to do was just smoke a little bit of weed and zone out and listen to jazz records or watch Rick and Morty. But that is considered illegal because the people in power either didn't like the racial groups who were more associated with it or had stocks or some sort of investments tied up in the cotton industry. And so the people who didn't have the power, their behavior was labeled as criminal. And then lastly, those people with power are less likely to be arrested, convicted, imprisoned, executed. And my prime example is that white swimmer dude, Brock. Do you guys remember him? He raped someone. And everyone was saying, oh, but he's a good kid because he comes from money. So the thing is with the conflict theories, when we apply it to criminology, is that it doesn't give us like this, it gives us an explanation of crime, but it just works differently from some of the other theories we've done. And then most of the time, it gives us this overview explanation of the past within the context of criminology, if that makes sense. So now we'll talk about two specific early conflict theories. So these were created like the early 1900s or so. I think we're looking at 1938-ish and then like 1950s-ish. Yeah. So yeah, early to mid 1900s. Now, to understand the context of this is during and after World War II, right after the massive Great Depression, right? So these were the vibes that were going on when these people came up with these theories. So Selin considered conflict between groups in terms of cultural groups, okay? So conflict theory can be applied to many groups, whether these are actual special interest groups, whether they're cultural groups, or they're just groups of people who have similar behaviors, groups of people with similar interests. It doesn't matter, right? But Selin applied it to cultural groups. And what Selin said is that any society, so let's say the United States of America, has several subcultures that exist within it, right? So for instance, in America, we have sort of white conservative culture, we have white liberal culture, we have Hispanic culture, we have a black culture, and you have Christian culture, right? You know, people who are college educated culture, right? So there's lots of cultural groups that exist within a society, and individuals can belong to multiple of these cultural groups, right? There's overlap or whatever. But what Selin said is that law reflects the dominant culture, meaning that there is conflict between some of these cultures, right? There's conflict between conservative white culture and black culture. There is conflict between liberal culture and conservative culture. There is conflict between conservative white culture and Hispanic culture. There's conflict between atheist culture and Christian culture in America, right? These cultural groups have different interests that they want to reflect in the law. And so Selin says this conflict is a normal part of society, it always exists, and that the law reflects the interest of whichever culture got control of the organized state. So in current today society, it's predominantly the white conservative culture is in control of our state via Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell. And so the law reflects their interests. And as a result, it can not necessarily discriminate, but not give a crap about the interests and values of the other cultures that exist within that society. And Selin said that there are two types of cultural conflicts that can exist in a society. You can have primary cultural conflicts. That's when conflicts occur between two cultures. So like when one culture colonizes another one, right? Or when there's just two separate cultures that always existed in a space and they're clashing. Or you can have secondary cultural conflicts. That's when you have a larger culture that diverges into several competing subcultures. So for instance, white culture split into sort of this liberal white hippie culture and conservative white culture. Christian culture has split into the fundamentalist evangelical Christian culture and the liberal Christian culture. And you can even say that there's been some splitting up between within black and Hispanic cultures. Right? And so it doesn't really matter what type of conflict culture you're in. You both can be happening at the same time. But the law is going to reflect the interests of the dominant culture. And so the culture that is not dominant is going to be scrutinized or penalized by the law a lot more than the other one. Right? So again, like, it doesn't really say this is why crime occurs. It just sort of says this is what happens. Right? It doesn't necessarily blame any particular person. It just sort of says this occurs. You have conflict. One group is going to be the winner. One group is going to be the loser. Or whatever. One group's going to be the winner. A bunch of other groups are going to be the loser. And so we can understand why crime occurs within that context. So it essentially says that crime is a normal part of life. Because that conflict, whoever gets to define the laws, right? They define crime. Then Wald took a different stance on it. So this came later in the 1950s. So what Wald did was he said, you have groups, whether they are cultural groups or special interest groups, or whether they are just groups of people who behave the same way, right? All these groups are constantly struggling for political power. And that is a normal part of society. But not only do these groups struggle for political power, they interact with each other. And as they interact with each other through conflict, sometimes this equilibrium is reached. Right? As two groups are struggling for each other, they sort of get to know each other. You get to understand each other. Right? And so social order or organization is achieved when these conflicting groups have adjusted to each other to reach a compromising equilibrium. Right? So, for instance, currently with the stimulus packages that are being thrown around, right? The Republicans want something that is a little cheaper, that helps out companies and banks more than the actual people, whereas Democrats in the House, they want they want 3 times as much money to help out individuals by sending out large paychecks. They want to forgive student debt. They want to uphold the large unemployment benefit, right? Those are their interests. And at the moment, they suck because they can't come to a compromising equilibrium. And as a result, people are freaking out. You guys notice the amount of buffoonery that's going around in our country right now? People are stressing. People are freaking out. People are rioting. Right? So there's no social organization or very little of it. So once we have these two conflicting groups reconcile on something, we can reach that equilibrium and we can get that social order. We can have progress. So the fact that there is friction and conflict is a normal and healthy part of society. But that friction and conflict needs to reach an equilibrium because that's what drives progress. But Wald also explains that the groups who are in power get to define crime. Then we have Donald Black's theory, and I love this theory. This is not so much it is considered a conflict theory, but it's not like the others. I love this theory. It's a sociological theory, and this theory doesn't necessarily try to explain why crime occurs or anything. It just sort of explains the behavior of law, how law behaves. Okay, and so what Donald Black, and the book is named The Behavior of Law. So what Donald Black said was, there's variations in both the style and quantity of the law. Meaning, what we mean by quantity of the law is that taking legal action. So a police officer reporting a crime, a citizen reporting a crime, punishing someone, charging someone with a crime, right? Like when the law is invoked, how much law is being used. And then the style of law, right? Law can function in many ways. For instance, law can be used to punish people. Law can be used to regulate people's behavior. Law can be used to reconcile two groups of people, right? Law can be used to separate people. Law can also be used to compensate people, like civil law, right? So think about all the ways the law can be used. And so that he refers to as the style. And so depending on different situations in society, different relationships between groups of people in society, the law varies within quantity and style. So again, this is not a theory that necessarily explains why crime occurs. It just helps us make sense of how the law is being used to address crime, right? So Donald Black said that law impacts, or law can differ within 5 social dimensions, okay, of social life. He said that social life has stratification, which is vertical distance between people, okay? And so this refers to how, the amount of wealth, right? And he said stratification, really, when you look at vertical distance, is the amount of wealth that people have, right? And so what he said, right? So he said, the higher a person is on the ladder of stratification, the more the person is able to invoke the law on his or her behalf. Okay? So that means that the more wealth I have, the more power I have, the more I can use the law. The more you can exercise the law over someone else. And that's why this theory is so compatible with conflict theory. Another aspect is morphology, right? And this is the relational distance between two people or two groups of people, right? He says that the law is almost inactive between people who are very intimate, right? Think about when you ever have a friend slap you in the face, and you're like, dude, what the hell did you do that for? Right? Or a friend played a prank on you. You're like, dude, what the hell? Or maybe you have one of those friends, they've owed you money for like 6 years and never paid you back. You don't call the cops over that, right? You don't report them for those little wrongs they do to you. But what if you're walking on the street and some random dude slaps you in the face? You're going to call the cops immediately. That's assault, right? So morphology refers to the vertical distance between people, and that really refers to relational difference. How intimate are you with people? Because the less intimate you are, the more likely you are going to rely on the law. Then another dimension of social life that Black talks about is culture. And he said the law is greater in a direction towards less culture than towards more culture. And the amount of cultural distance linearly affects the amount of law. So this is essentially a fancy way of saying the more you are a part of the dominant culture, the less law will be used to deal with you as an offender. Okay? So this is, again, it's kind of similar to conflict theory here again. So let's say there is so again, like if, and this sort of explains, right, a little bit of that social disorganization too that exists in those zone 2s in some cities, right? Because you have all these different cultural groups who live in a small area, and they tend to call the cops on each other a lot. Again, because they don't get each other. They don't get one another. Right? Like if another criminal justice PhD punched me in the face today, I will probably not call the cops. But if some student punched me in the face, I would probably call the cops. Because they are far more distant from my culture than the other PhD in criminology. Even though me and this other PhD in criminology might not be intimate, right? We might still be very distant from each other, but we are of the same culture, so there's a little bit more familiarity. And so therefore, I'll probably exercise less law. A fourth dimension was organization. And so what Black means by this is that if offenders are more organized than their victims, then there would be less law used to address any victimization. So this means sort of like formal organization. So like a corporation or a business or a government group or a militia group. Less law would be used against them. And here, let me give you an example, right? Remember back during the mask riots, right? Remember that before the George Floyd thing, you had all these white militia groups with their guns go to City Hall and stand there and say, I'm not going to wear a mask because I'm a big baby, right? You guys remember that? The cops didn't do squat to them. The cops just stood there. These people were armed with freaking assault rifles. They had bulletproof vests on, saying that they're going to storm capitals, they're going to take shit over. And the police just stood there. But then you have one black person who might be perceived to have a gun and police shoot him. Or they sit on his neck for 9 minutes until he dies crying for his mom. It's because those militia groups were more organized than the one unarmed black person. That's why corporations can kill us, put cancer-causing stuff in our food, and get away with it. And they get fined a couple $1 million, which is a freaking drop in the bucket for them. But I go and I drive 14 miles an hour over the speed limit and I get a freaking $300 ticket. Because I'm endangering lives, man. The more organized you are, the less law will be used against you. And again, that is a conflict type of perspective. Again, when you're more organized, you probably have more power. Maybe not financial power, but more power. Hell, some airlines will weigh the cost of, well, if a plane crashes and we get sued by all of the family on this plane, how much will that cost us versus having to routinely upkeep this plane? That is a calculation that's made by these corporations. Is it going to be cheaper for us to just let 200 people die every 30 years in a plane crash and then we pay off their families to get off our backs than it would be for us to routinely maintain this plane? That kind of rhymed. Maintain the plane. It's bonkers. Right? But this theory, they explain things that are already happening in society. But do they explain why one person commits a crime? Not really. And lastly, and this is my favorite part about Donald Black's theory, he talks about social control. And he says that there are two types of social control. You have the law, which is formal social control, and then you have social controls, which is informal, kind of like what Travis Hershey talked about, right? Informal social controls. These are controls like when I want to punch somebody, but I don't because my wife will be mad at me. She controlled my behavior, but it wasn't the law that did it. And so what Donald Black says is that if there is a breakdown in informal social controls, there's going to be an increase in the law. So when there is less informal social control, there will be more formal social control. When there's more formal social control, there will be less informal social control. And this is important because I remember when I was in high school. I was in high school. My parents went out of town for like 2 evenings, and so I had a massive party at my parents' house. Right? And so my neighbor who knew us came over. He said, "Dude, I don't want to get you in trouble with your parents. I don't want to call the cops because we're all friends. So I need you to stop this party now, or we're going to have issues." So I stopped the party, sent them home. That was an informal control. And there was no law being used. I remember when I just moved into an apartment in Pennsylvania when I was working on my master's degree, me and my roommate threw a freaking rager. We threw a rager. People were drinking, were blasting. What was that? Was it Roscoe that sang the song? It was like, "All the Way Turned Up." You guys remember that song? I love that song. And the Soldier Boy. Okay, anyways. Okay. So we're listening to all this great music and playing spades and drinking, was it cognac? I think we were drinking cognac that night. Ugh. Man, just saying cognac just gave my stomach that feeling. And then all of a sudden the cop showed up. Some person who didn't know us didn't want to come knock on the door and say, "Hey, stop." So they called the cops. And you can explain that instance through through horizontal distance. You can explain it through cultural difference. You can explain it through informal and formal social control. Right? There was no informal connection between me and my neighbor, and so the cops had to come in and do it. The downside to Donald Black's law is that there's not a lot of Donald Black's theory is that there's not a lot of scientific support for it. But it makes a lot of sense. It explains a lot, right? There's a lot of logic to it. And it's not really a book that says these are the types of policies we need to make, these are the changes we need to make. It just sort of says this is how the law works. And so you can expect X when Y is present. I like it. I like theories like that. But again, I like those theories because it helps me understand the world. But from a scientific perspective, theories like that, in my opinion, are not very useful. So just like how the conflict is a whole perspective within sociology, philosophy, and criminology, the same can be said for critical criminology, but it focuses predominantly on criminology. And, some textbooks will sometimes put these two together as if they are the same. And what I mean by that is they'll put conflict and critical criminology sort of together because they do focus a lot on power imbalances. But when it comes to critical criminology, the way that it works is, so normal, quote unquote, normal criminology is based in the scientific method, which sort of is based in this idea of objectivity, meaning that I don't have a dog in the fight. I just want to see what causes what. What causes crime? I'm not saying that we should do this, we should do that. All I'm saying is I want to know, why is this person committing crime and this person not? Right? That is supposed to be the objective view, right? You don't have a dog in the fight, you just want to know. The critical perspective says that's not true. You can't separate values and morals from science. And that we need to use our research agenda to help disprivileged segments of society. And so, where they then overlap with the conflict perspective is that it also focuses on the power thing. But critical criminology is very much, this is how things should be, as opposed to quote unquote normal criminology, which focuses on this is how things are, this is what is. Now, there are many gazillion critical criminological theories and perspectives, but we're going to focus on 4 of the most popular ones. Now, again, I will state that I am not into critical criminology. However, critical criminology has its place, and we all need to study it. We all need to know it, because critical criminology provides good rhetorical arguments. It also provides new avenues of research that we can address with the quote-unquote objective scientific method, right? So the good thing with critical criminology is it questions a lot of what we already know about criminology. It pokes holes. It finds weaknesses in arguments. And so there is a place for it. But my objection to critical criminology is, and what a lot of people will say, is that there isn't a lot of scientific support for it. And a lot of critical criminologists will argue that there doesn't necessarily need to be, or that that the research that's been conducted has sort of purposely, because of myriad reasons, not focused on the issues that critical theorists bring about. However, a lot of these theories are so big picture sometimes that it's difficult to study them, right? They're almost unstudyable, because we don't have the technology or the research techniques or statistical procedures to really study what these theories say. And then there's postmodernism, which we will talk about here in a little bit. Okay. So we're going to talk about 4 important critical perspectives, and that is Marxism, postmodernism, green criminology, and feminist criminology. Again, this is just like the conflict perspectives. These are not really theories. Like the Marxist is a theory, postmodernism sort of is a theory, but green criminology and feminist criminology are more just sort of, they try to, they're less theoretical in a sense. And so we will cover those as we continue. Okay, so we're going to talk about Marxism as in what Marxism was when Karl Marx came up with it. And then we're going to discuss how Marxism was applied to criminology. So there's sort of basic Marxism, but Karl Marx himself doesn't speak a lot about crime. He sort of mentions it in passing. But when you apply the Marxist theory to criminology, you can begin to explain crime with it. So the basics of Marxism is that he says that in a society you have material production, which is sort of the ability of a society to produce actual goods, right? So technology, food, and all that stuff. And then you have social relations of production. This refers to, so essentially says, let's say the United States, we have a bunch of material goods and services that we can produce as a nation, but then there also needs to be some sort of social relationship, right? That says, hey, this is how we need to distribute the stuff between us, or this is how we need to profit from it. These are the rules we need to make about the material production. And he says that societies, when it comes to material production of things like technology and food and physical things, right? That's a constant thing. That will happen no matter who you are. You'll always be producing something, and it will most likely always be growing. But he says that with social relations, there tends to be periods of sort of quote-unquote progress and periods of freezing or regress. And oftentimes the social relations will at the beginning will enhance the means of production, but then there gets a point where the means of material production becomes too strong or too fast, or the social relations haven't really caught up with the material production, and that causes problems within a society. So, to give you a more practical understanding, is currently we have this issue in the United States where automation is getting a little crazy. Okay, so from a material means of production, we are creating technology like algorithms that can solve problems for us and do things that humans no longer have to do. Like, for instance, like cashiers or people who work at the front of like a fast food place. Those jobs are soon going to be replaced or vastly diminished with apps and algorithms. And you can already go to McDonald's and just click on the screen and order your food without even having to talk to someone, right? So this is not just happening at at fast food places or at Walmart, but it's happening everywhere across all facets of industry. So the problem with that is that within a few years, what's going to happen is that there's not going to be a need for human labor, or not going to be as much of a need for human labor. And so how we as a society deal with that socially is going to impact sort of the whether we'll be able to continue to progress as a society, right? If we as a society, like if our social relations, so our focus on sort of this free market capitalism, our focus on, you have to earn your own keep, the government doesn't give handouts, right? If those types of social relations continue the way they are right now, and the means of production doesn't create new jobs that are being replaced by algorithms and by automation, right? The current way the way we're thinking right now and we're interacting with each other is not going to match up with what the material goods are and the way we're producing it in society in 20 to 30 years. And that's going to cause friction, which can cause revolution or digression or something bad. Right, so if you guys remember the Democratic primaries, Andrew Yang, he was sort of like this fringe candidate who was talking about the universal income. And a lot of people were saying, dude, that's socialism. And it's like, okay, well, first of all, number one, socialism isn't necessarily a bad thing, but nonetheless, what he said is that each person in the United States should get $1,000 a month from the government. And people are like, how are you going to pay for that? And he's like, well, you make the companies that are making money hand over fist by automate. So whenever you implement something that automates a job that you now sort of eliminate, that company has to pay a certain amount of the profit they get from that to the government, that then goes into a government fund that then pays $1,000 to every single human being. Because Andrew Yang was saying, look, in 20, 30, 50 years, we're going to be eliminating a lot of jobs. What's going to be the case in 100 years? What's going to be the case in 200 years? Are people even going to work? How is work going to work? And so he was looking at the social relations of production and anticipating where the material forces of production were going to go. And he was like, we need to do something about it. And it makes sense that Marx came up with this theory, because when he came up with this, he was looking at when European nations were switching from this feudalism system to becoming more industrialized, right? And so what he saw was that at a certain point, when there was enough technological change in the feudalist societies, the way of thinking and doing and interacting with each other was no longer working, right? And so he was saying that at that point, the social forces needed to change. And so he was looking at feudalism. The Industrial Revolution happened, right? And that required significant changes in social relations. And so out of the industrial revolution came the concept of bourgeoisie capitalism, right? And bourgeoisie capitalism at that point in time was important. That was considered progressive. That was good for the further development of material forces, of material goods. And we can see that there is a change that needs to happen in today's society again. And this is another example, right? In the last 15 years, social media and the internet has completely changed the way we consume and are exposed to knowledge. Before then, those of you who might not have been alive or around, you would get information from magazines, newspapers, and books. And there wasn't a lot of opportunity for magazines, newspapers, and books to be trash. Yes, you had your tabloids, and yes, you had some trashy magazines, but everyone knew what was considered good knowledge and what was considered bad knowledge. But now with the explosion of the internet, it is extremely difficult to determine what is good knowledge and what is bad knowledge, right? So the way of thinking and going about consuming knowledge needs to change with the massive influx in both quantity and quality of knowledge. Because as a result, we're getting people who are making a pandemic way worse than it needed to be by denying that we need to wear masks, or people who think it's completely fake, or people who believe that Donald Trump is somehow stopping a cabal of elitist pedophiles from running our country, or where people think they can take hydrochloroquine with zinc and they will not have to worry about coronavirus. And so this is also an example of that, is that the way we were going, our social relations, the way we were talking to each other, thinking, consuming knowledge, and now this new material production, there needs to be a change in our thinking. Because if there isn't, we're not going to progress. Because if we don't change that, and we just constantly keep on quarreling with each other over social media, and people showing bullshit information and buying into that, just like the way that we buy into science, there's never going to be enough progress, especially in a democratic society. You have to understand, democracy relies on information. People vote based on the information they were exposed to. And if you're exposed to bad information, then democracy will fail. And so something needs to change. I'm not saying we need to change democracy, but there needs to be a change in the way that we consume and sift through science. And we don't know how we're going to do that yet. So anyways, back to Marx. So Marx said you had this change from feudalism to industrialism. And when the means of production sort of forced everyone to think like capitalists, right, where the whole capitalist way of thinking came about, that allowed a lot of progress, right? And then he said, based on this, what's going to happen is the capitalist way of thinking is going to become fixed, just like the feudalist way of thinking is going to become fixed. And then when the material means of production need to change significantly again in the future, which is maybe now, maybe 20 years from now, the capitalist way of thinking is going to need to be replaced, because it is going to hinder progress. And so he sort of focused on capitalism in terms of what's going to happen to capitalism. How bad is it going to get? All right? So this is different from the rhetoric that Republicans tried to promulgate, because it's not necessarily that Marx hates capitalism. Marx came about and he said, look at feudalism. That needed to go at some point, and now capitalism is helping us move things forward. However, we have to understand that at some point, capitalism is going to have to go too. And it's going to have to be replaced by a new way of thinking. Now, unfortunately, he said that communism is going to be the way to do it, right? And we all saw how communism worked, but then you can also make the argument that maybe those nations that experimented with communism experimented with it too early, that the means of production weren't ready for it yet, right? That the material forces of production weren't ready for it yet. But anyways, so he said what's going to happen is capitalism will contract. What'll happen is it will separate society into two groups, and he calls those two groups the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? Who here has ever heard the term, ooh, that's so bougie. Oh, I got the most bougie this. I got a bougie stroller, right? My wife and I, we have a nice bougie stroller. And ever heard that term? That's so bougie. Well, that comes from the term bourgeoisie. Yeah. Bourgeoisie meaning rich AF. You own all the means in production. You're the haves. And then the have-nots are the proletariat. Now, if you've ever read 1984 by George Orwell, right, the people who are not Big Brother are known as the proles. Yeah, that's based on Marx's proletariat. So most of us, if you're here listening to me right now, most of us are proletariat, right? We are the wage workers. So the bourgeoisie are the people who own businesses. They own the means of production, the means of material production. They own it, right? And then the proletariat work for those people to make a wage. But what he says is the bourgeoisie will become increasingly greedy because that's how capitalism works. Capitalism is all about get more, get money, get money, get money, get money. So if I own a business and I'm making money, and the way we think in this society is make money, make money, make money, well, then I'm going to do whatever I need to do to make that money, to make more money. This one dude's making more money than me. I'm going to make more money than them. And so what happens? Well, price fixing, right? And this happens. This has happened. Companies come together and they say, hey, if we all charge $500, so let's say Sony and Microsoft, they come together. Hey, look. We know that people are either going to buy a PlayStation or an Xbox. And we know that we can sell these things for $200 a piece. Microsoft, I can sell this Xbox for $200. And then no one's going to buy the PlayStation at $500. But, hey, why don't we both sell them within $100 of each other? Yeah, like we'll come up with like a cheaper version too. I'm not saying this actually happened, but I'm just using this as an example. This does happen in other industries, the medical industry, pharmaceuticals. I'm sure it's probably happened in the gaming industry as well. Now, it's illegal to do that, but it still happens, right? There's many ways of going around it. Why is it that a Whopper costs about as much as a Big Mac? I mean, yeah. Look at OPEC. OPEC was this alliance of countries that sold oil. They literally decided the price of oil. I don't know if you remember, you probably don't, but in like 2005, the freaking gas prices shot up to like $4 in a matter of months. It's freaking OPEC. Now, this is not within the United States, but these are still bourgeoisie deciding, hey, we need to make more money. We're going to just jack up the price of oil. Anyways, you can Google OPEC, right? It's whack. But anyway, so what he said is that the bourgeoisie are going to try to make as much money as possible. They're going to try to screw over the proletariat as much as possible, right? Pay them less. And you can already see that right now. Right, you get these damn baby boomers that are like, well, I worked for $6 an hour when I was in college and I was able to pay my way through college and have a girlfriend. It's like, yeah, dude, but $6 an hour then is like making $28 an hour today. Yeah, sure, if I worked at frickin' Domino's Pizza making $28 an hour, great. I can do all those things. Our time has become worth less. I see my brother-in-law. He worked. He got laid off with coronavirus. He worked for one of the big 4 accounting firms, right? Now, my dad also worked for one of those firms when I was growing up, before he taught at the university and then moved to the whatever, who cares? I saw how hard my dad worked when I was a kid. On weekends, he was chilling. He didn't work. He came home from work. Work stayed at work. We hung out as a family. Bam. Now I see my brother-in-law working the same job that my dad worked, but it was maybe 25 years later. And he's pulling all-nighters. We went to a cabin. We rented a cabin last summer to go vacation together, as my sister and her husband, and my wife and my daughter and whatever. He was working the entire time on his laptop, and it was over the weekend because he needed to get work done that was put on his plate by the people who own the company. Your time. Yeah, you might be getting paid similar to what people were getting paid back in the day in some of these jobs, but you're doing a lot more work for it. And that's what Karl Marx was saying will happen, is that incrementally, over time, the bourgeoisie will do things to make more money, to give less to the proletariat, because that is the nature of capitalist thinking. Progress, get better, get faster, make more. And what's going to happen is that at some point, only 1% of people or less is going to own most of the wealth. And you know where we are today? 1% owns 99% of the wealth in this country, in the world. And so he started thinking, and this is back in the day, and he was already talking about automation and mechanization. Now, he didn't know about the internet and whatever, but he was like, machines are going to replace people. Then what's going to happen? And he calls that the capitalist contradiction. Essentially, think of it like this, right? There is a finite amount of resources. There literally is a finite amount of money, okay? And everyone in our society is grabbing at some of it. Some are grabbing a whole lot more of it than others, right? But at some point, all of this will be grabbed up. And then people will be trading this money for things. Now, if the people who have most of the money in this process of capitalism get all of it, then they have a bunch of money and no one else has anything. So 2 things will happen. One of 2 things can happen. The whole economic system will collapse. Because just think about, like, if Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, and like Elon Musk and Bill Gates, if those 3 people own all of the money in this country, what's going to happen? You can't buy groceries. You can't buy an Xbox that gives money to Bill Gates. You can't buy anything off Amazon that gives money to Jeff Bezos. Then you can't pay to go to school. I don't have a job, right? So at some point, when the bourgeoisie take all of the money, there's a point where the entire economy will collapse. Or there's a point where, before that happens, where the proletariat are like, all right, we outnumber these people, let's go murder them. And so what Karl Marx was saying is that at some point, something bad's going to happen if society doesn't realize a change needs to occur. And that's what's very disconcerting for me and many other people, is those of us who think that the United States Constitution should not be a living document, that it should be a fixed document. I'm scared about that. Because if our society doesn't change our social relations, we might see some problems in the future. Now, here's the problem. How do you research this? You don't. You can't. It's difficult. You can't just take a society and be like, all right, now for the next 1,000 years, we're going to collect data on you. The only way you can study is by looking back in history with the information that's available, right? History isn't written for people to be like, oh, someone's going to do a massive study on it one day. No, people write history the way they write it. And we'll get into postmodernism here in a second. So it's difficult to study whether this is actually true, but you can see some glimpses or some glimmers of truth in this, right? We're seeing it already that when it comes to basic health care in this country, it is a damn battle. We also see that people who run our country get a minimum salary of $172,000 a year. And these are the people who are voting for us to not have single-payer health care. Literally, the bourgeoisie are running our country, and they're saying, if you're poor, you don't get to live as long as me. So yeah, there are some instances where like, oh, Karl Marx was right. But now if we apply Karl Marx's theory to criminology, right, it's very similar to the conflict perspective. These theorists who apply his views to criminology say that capitalism, from a social perspective, makes everyone somewhat greedy. And yeah, I mean, when it comes to selling weed, there's greed in there, right? You're breaking the law to be greedy. When it comes to white-collar crime, there's greed in there. But like, all of us are a little greedy. I mean, why are you in college? It's because you think coming to college is going to put you in a position to make more money than if you didn't. The problem is that the law mostly legalizes the greed of the bourgeoisie. Or if it doesn't punish the bourgeoisie as harshly as it would punish the proletariat. And let me give you a primary freaking example. Sorry, I'm fired up about this. The people who make Oxycontin killed millions of Americans. Killed them. Friends of mine. People who I know's children died because of Oxycontin. Lives ruined because of Oxycontin. You know what they got? They got a freaking fine, and they were told, we're going to disband your company. No one is being put to death. I mean, just think, if there was a serial killer that killed 1 million people in this country, you think we're not going to give them the death penalty? You think we're not going to give them like a gazillion life sentences without parole? No, they're a business. They get to get away with it. We'll just take their money from them. Criminologists also say that the law is used to enforce the social relations of capitalism, which is bad news bears. And again, you can see that in in the fact that Donald Trump and his minions want to destroy Obamacare. Right? That's not capitalist. Yet most of the people who are making these laws were never, ever in that situation. They grew up rich, with rich families. And they see it as, well, my dad worked hard. You should work hard too. But at some point, Mr. Bourgeoisie, no matter how hard you work as the proletariat, there are only so much resources that can be earned. And so crime then is the result of the lumpen proletariat, the people who are disillusioned by the system. So this kind of touches on that general strain theory and Merton's strain theory. It kind of touches on labeling theory. It touches on, my goodness, what's the other one? Social learning theories, social disorganization, anomie. And so socialism then, according to these Marxist criminologists, say that it would reduce some crime. It won't cure crime. Crime will always exist, but it will reduce some crime. So what is socialism? Well, socialism is essentially the government taxes really the ultra-rich more, and that money is then used to provide services to the people who don't make that much money. I don't see what's so bad about that. But our politicians are promulgating these social relations of you need to work hard, you don't deserve anything, nothing in this world is free. And something that also is important is that criminologists, see, this is why it's called critical criminology, right? They're sort of critical of the existing system, right? They offer some solutions, but it's not as intense as the previous theories that we've studied, which is why I'm not really a big fan of this vein of criminology, but it still makes a lot of sense, right? It explains a lot of what's going on today, which is good. It's good to know this, but this doesn't help us get to feasible solutions necessarily. It helps us identify the problem. So another thing that's important is the law is used to legalize certain social injustices, right? Like, oh, you have your First Amendment right, so now I can say all lives matter when it's indeed Black Lives Matter. Right? When Trump goes and says, stand by, or stand back and stand by, Proud Boys. It was a racist group. Oh, there's good people on both sides. That's their First Amendment right to say a bunch of racist stuff. When you see companies polluting our environment, the argument's made, well, the capitalist social relations say we shouldn't regulate businesses. The private sector will regulate itself. It provides power to the customer. Yeah, right. So yeah, that's Marxism. And Marxist criminology, essentially, Marxist criminology says, look, we can explain why crime exists on a very overhead view because the social relations and the means of production, the material means of production, aren't matching up right now. And most of crime that exists today are a result of capitalism. And now we're going to talk about postmodernism. It's not my favorite. I have some videos that I posted on Blackboard that go deeper into postmodernism, but so postmodernism is focused on language, right? So let's think about this for a second, right? Essentially, what postmodernism says is there's no truth, there's no objective truth, and you can appreciate this, all right? Like nothing in this world, right? You have what is actually real, what is actually valid and real, right? And human beings have, since the beginning of human beings, trying to figure out what the actual real truth is, right? And some of us have been trying to do that through writing religious scripture, saying, well, God created the earth, God did this, God did that, right? Others said, I reject that. We're going to focus on observation and logic, which became science, out of which became modernism. Other people just look at the earth and are like, oh, the earth is flat, right? So other people have like very different ways of coming up with what is true, what they think is true. But nonetheless, human beings, since the beginning of time, have been trying to figure out what the truth is, right? But the way that we communicate this is through language. And when I speak, all language, all the language we used is in some way biased. And so when we use language to write scientific findings, that language in itself is also biased, meaning that there can be no objective truth. At the same time, science is not perfect in establishing what the actual truth is. Neither is religious or theology. Neither is crazy crackpot theories. Nothing. So essentially, postmodernism says that human beings do not know what the actual truth is. And that any attempt at establishing what reality actually is just another attempt. And it should be held at that face value. Now, that in itself is good, right? Always be critical of everything. Sure. But the problem with postmodernism is that it gives science the same time of day that it gives QAnon, that it gives certain religious paradigms. And that's all fine and dandy in philosophy, but it's not, in my opinion, fine and dandy in an evidence-based world. Because you guys probably remember me saying that postmodernism is good, but it's very dangerous. And we're seeing that happening right now, where our president says there's alternative facts. I don't believe this. I don't believe these facts. I'd rather believe a doctor than science. Oh, science doesn't know. You guys remember that? When our president, the president of the United States of America, when confronted with hard science about how we're destroying the environment, says science doesn't know. That is the dangers of postmodernism. But there is a lot of validity in postmodernism. Now, one thing that annoys the living daylights out of me regarding postmodernism is the fact that defining postmodernism in itself contradicts postmodernism. Yeah. Defining what postmodernism is contradicts postmodernism. So the way to think about postmodernism is it's just a way of thinking. You're saying, hey, look, there are many ways to go about one thing. And that we should maybe sometimes heed the approaches of less popular ways of doing things. This is great in the arts, right? When you're painting, right? And the postmodern, you can see postmodernism in terms of art, where people do crazy creative things because they're painting in ways that have been super unpopular. Or you can see it in music. But when it comes to criminology and other science and the medical sciences, I think postmodernism is good to have in the back of your head. But when it comes to generating evidence, I feel like there's qualitatively a difference between a crackpot theory and the scientific method. Yes, we should always know our scientific findings should always be taken with a grain of salt because of the language we use. Because science will never be 100% truth, but it is more so than a crackpot theory based in nothing. So, I used the example earlier of how history has been written. And that's where I think postmodernism comes in very well. Is that the language used to describe historical events are not objective, right? Someone writing about the history, for instance, I'll give you an example, right? When you look at the Old Testament of the Bible, right? A lot of people were like, oh, Moses wrote it. No, he didn't. It turns out there's like 4 different scrolls, right? You had the J scroll, the E scroll, the P scroll, and then 2 D scrolls. And then you had a person later on, during the Second Temple era, take all those scrolls and cut and paste them together into what we now know as the Old Testament. All right? And so when you read just the P scroll, so for instance, like, I don't know if any of you have ever read the Bible, but whatever. When you read the Old Testament, you'll see there's a lot of doublets, meaning like you'll see the same, you'll see like 2 lines that say almost the exact same thing. And that's because this person who redacted all these scrolls into one didn't want to like throw anything away. Okay? And so you get this one scroll that was, so you have the J, the E, the P, the D, and the 2 D scrolls, right? And so at a certain point in time, J and E were put together, right, they were redacted. And then at the same time, when there was so this J and E scroll that was created, right, was written by people who was written by people who valued Moses, right? So when you read just the J and E stories about Moses, it is very, very flattering towards him. But then you have this P source, right, that was written somewhat later. And this was right around the time when the Israel and Judah were reunited. So the people were coming together, right? And so there was a sect of priests who believed sort of in, who descended from Aaron, who was Moses' brother, right? Yeah, I think it was his brother. And they wrote a version of the Israelite history that casts a kind of negative light on Moses, but a much more positive light on Aaron, because they descended from this person. And now when the Israelites and Judah came together, they were bringing this J and E source scroll with them. And now the people who are living under the Aaronid priests were reading this. And so the Aaronid priests say, hey, we have to write our own version of the story. Otherwise it's going to hurt our status. We need to write a version of the Israelite history that makes us look legitimate. And so they wrote the P source. And so the reason why I'm explaining this to you is that when we write history, everyone who writes has an agenda. Everyone who uses language, communication, has an agenda. No one can be truly objective. And that's what postmodernism is. And so postmodernism is good when we have that mindset of like, okay, look, I know this is hardcore science. However, I need to know that there was probably an agenda. Or when you're reading the Bible and you say, I know this is about the God I believe in, but the men and women, men who wrote these scrolls and the person who redacted them had an agenda. And so when I read this, I need to be aware of it. That is where postmodernism is good. But where postmodernism is bad is when they say, well, science is just another perspective. I don't believe in science. Well, you're going to die early. you're going to kill a lot of people because of that, right? At some point, rhetoric is rhetoric and science is science. At some point, no matter how much you say the coronavirus is a hoax, you're going to contract it. And so understanding that there's different ways of understanding things, different ways of communicating our thoughts, is important within the context of criminology. Because those in power control the discourse. Have you ever read the United States law? Do you think that makes sense to you? Have you ever read it? Read the law. That law was written predominantly by white people. A lot of the laws, look at our Congress right now. How many white people are in there versus minority groups? They're the ones that are writing the laws. And even the ones who belong to minority groups went to law schools that have been around when people of minority groups weren't allowed to go to law school. And so the whole process of writing and learning and creating law is stuck in an agenda. So when you read the actual United States laws, it's like, what the hell am I reading? The legalese. What the hell am I reading? This does not make sense to me. Now, one thing that we do know is that when white people read the law, it makes more sense to them than when people from minority groups read the law. And you know why that is? Is because the law is predominantly the product of white people. So that's one way where postmodernist thinking is important, because you're like, oh, dude, the language. You're not speaking everyone's language here. This language was written with a certain agenda. We need to be aware of this when we apply this law. That not everyone might understand it the exact same way because it's not communicated in a way that's necessarily friendly to everyone that exists within this society. Again, an example where postmodernist thinking is good. So, in my opinion, postmodernism is welcome when we are discussing myriad social artifact, meaning when we're discussing a bunch of different things that humans produce, whether it's art, whether it's law, whether it's theology. But where I don't think it is as welcome is when we're talking about systematic observation and logic. Postmodernism should be used, and it is being used, to say, hey, might there be something wrong with the way I'm interpreting things and I'm conceptualizing things and I'm writing things within the context of science? Cool. Let's be aware of that. And we are doing that. When you read a scientific article, there's always a section on the limitations. There's also always a section on how the authors interpreted their data. That is the influence of postmodernism on science. And I think that is healthy enough. Because if we constantly sit here saying, well, this could have been interpreted this way, this could be done this way, then there's never going to be progress. If we're constantly sitting here criticizing everything we're producing as humans, there's never going to be something done. The issue is that something needs to be done for it to be criticized. And so postmodernism is useful because it helps us to criticize the way we communicate, to think critically about the way we communicate, which is, in the book, they refer to that as language systems or language. It's just the way we communicate. Any way we communicate, whether it's through talking, writing, singing, painting. You're criticizing, hey, how was this communicated, and how might this reflect the truth? To what extent might this reflect the truth? Might this not reflect the truth? And that is healthy. But when it comes to hard science, it shouldn't put science as just another perspective. Because that leads to danger. That leads to the unraveling of our democracy. Green criminology is a new emerging form of criminology, but it is not a theory at all. Green criminology is the product of postmodern thinking because, again, it started questioning the law and how it is applied and communicated. And essentially, the way that green criminology works is it says, we're not necessarily looking at things that are illegal, but we're looking at harm that's caused to the environment. And so what we mean by the environment is plants, animals, humans, anything that's the environment, right? So like what type of harm is being caused? So essentially where postmodernism came in, it was like, why are we only caring about human beings? Like what makes a human being more important than an animal, right? Because in the way that we had communicated for millennia, right, human beings, we sort of just automatically put ourselves above animals, right? And even in the sciences, we do that. Like we freaking test things on mice before we test it on us, right? And so from a postmodernist perspective, we're like, wait, why are we better than animals? Is it just because we're in control that we're better than them, right? So that is a good product of postmodernism, right? And so it brings about this, hey, wait, let's try to look at crime not just as harm against, not just as illegal activity or deviance, but let's look at crime as harm that's conducted or that is caused against plants, animals, and humans. And so there's no particular theory here. It is just we use other criminological theories that have been created, like any of the theories we've covered up to this point, but predominantly, I mean, if you look at the amount of theories that have been applied to green criminology, the green criminology, it's been mostly critical and conflict theories. However, you can apply routine activity, neoclassical, social structural, social process, maybe even psychological and biological, I don't know. But nonetheless, it's when you're applying already existing theories that aren't necessarily bound to just criminology. There's some other theories outside of criminology that have been applied to understanding the harm that's being caused against plants, animals, and humans. And so understanding poaching, right? Applying routine activities theory to poaching, that's green criminology. Understanding maybe applying some sort of conflict theory, Marxism to deforestation, that's green criminology. So it's not a single theory, it's just applying criminological thinking to how we're destroying the earth. And that's why I love green criminology. I love green criminology. And I love that this came out of postmodernist thinking, right? So I'm not just hating on postmodernist thinking. This and the next thing we're going to talk about are great examples of where postmodernism is appropriate. And there it comes to my favorite result of postmodernist thinking, feminism. So feminism is important to me because I have a daughter, I have a wife, I have sisters, I have a mom, and also, you know, everyone should be treated equally, right? And that's what feminism is. Feminism says, hey, wait a second. Women have just sort of automatically been put in the back seat. Why? Why aren't we the same as men? What? That's feminism in a nutshell. in a very, very, very small nutshell. But it comes from postmodernist thinking. It's like, hey, everything has just sort of been around the man. What the hell? Why can't I play football? Why can't I be on SportsCenter? Why do I have to wear pink? Why can't I be good at video games? That is postmodernist thinking about men and what we call patriarchy. And so feminism then on its own is saying, wait, there's this implicit bias towards men in all of society. Men have sort of run the show forever, right? And it seemed to be born out of some of the natural differences between men and women, right? Men have broader shoulders, blah, 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 and women give birth. And so as a result, there's differences in society, and they need to be explained. All right, so I posted a video about what feminism is. I think I posted 2 videos. You can look at those. But essentially, feminism is just saying men and women should be treated equally in many aspects of society. And so there are many kinds of feminism. And so you get liberal feminism, which is, for the longest time, was the most popular form of feminism, which is just sort of like, they just try to sort of figure out, well, how did, within existing structures of society, where are there some injustices and how can we fix them, right? So like gender wage gaps and stuff, right? They don't try to flip the whole script on everything. They're like, hey, let's just pay women more and then we're fine. But then you have critical feminism, right, which challenges existing social structure, right? Critical feminism has come out of liberal feminism saying, hey, look, and it sort of opposes and it says, hey, look, what are some of the challenges that causes women to be subservient to men, right? And so out of that came 3 different types of feminism. Radical feminism focuses on the concept of patriarchy. And frankly, all of the critical ones focus on the concept of patriarchy. But what it says is radical feminism says patriarchy came from feudalism, all right? And this is how social relations were during feudalism, where there were certain sex roles that were socialized and became ingrained in society, where men dominate women. Now, it's not like men are actively sort of aggressively trying to dominate women. It's just become naturalized through social. It's become normalized, right? You can see where postmodern thinking comes in. It's like, wait, why is this normal? Why is it normal for a woman to not be able to speak in church? Or why is it normal for the woman to take care of the kids and not the man? Why is it normal for the man to have a job and the woman stay at home, right? It was just that postmodern thinking came in there, right? And so radical feminism focuses on the concept of patriarchy, which is this socially ingrained system of thinking or structure, right, that has existed since the feudal age. And they say that needs to change. Marxist feminism also nods to the concept of patriarchy, and it also says that the root of gender roles are in socialization. But they said that male dominance lies in men's ownership and control of the means of economic production. So essentially, remember when we talked about Marxism, you had the social stuff and like the material stuff, right? And they said that essentially men have all the power in the material stuff. They own all that stuff, right? Because again, of feudalism. So patriarchy is tied to the economic structure of capitalism. And that causes a sexual division of labor where there are certain jobs that men do and certain jobs that women do. And women get paid less. Why do nurses get paid less than doctors? Why do teachers get paid less than principals? And so the law, according to Marxist feminists, is used to keep this division of labor, this sexual division of labor, up, to keep women down. Because women rising to power would threaten capitalism. And so law, according to Marxist feminists, says is a direct instrument of oppression towards women, created by men. And again, look at how many men are how much of a freaking disaster was the 2016 election because a woman dared run for president. Most of our lawmakers are men and have been men, making laws about what women should do and how they should behave, their bodies. Socialist feminism took the ideas of both Marxist and radical feminism and focused particularly on the natural reproductive differences between the sexes. And they say that those differences, that the fact that men don't get pregnant and don't have to carry kids, right? Those natural differences underlie the relationships between men and women. So before birth control, women had to deal with menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, menopause. And all that made them more dependent on men for their physical survival. And because of those biological needs, women naturally took the role of nursing and taking care of children, staying at home. And this care that they needed to give to the children who stayed at home, because they are the ones who get pregnant and give birth, led to the sexual division of labor, meaning that women do certain jobs and men do other jobs. And so according to these theorists, the socialist feminists, getting back or finding equality is not through taking over the means of production, but by taking over control of their bodies and their own reproductive functions. Once women are in control of their reproductive functions, you can have an egalitarian society. And again, that's postmodern thinking. Wait, why are we doing things? Why have we always been doing things this way? Wait, why do women have to listen to men? Why do women have to be subservient? Wait, why do we treat animals differently than humans? Wait, why do we just assume that capitalist thinking is the only way of thinking? Wait, why is the law written this way? That is postmodernist thinking within the context of critical criminology. If this has been very confusing to you, I understand. This part of criminology is confusing to many. It also requires a lot of reading, and frankly, there are very few textbooks that can effectively communicate this part of criminology. So I tried my best here today. I also uploaded some good videos that you should watch if this doesn't do it for you.